John, thanks again for giving us more time to speak with you about your career and learn more about the history and a little bit about the future of WMS industry. In part one, we went back to the late 1960s and discussed reflective tape and data collection. We spoke a little bit about Logisticon and kind of your progression up through the ranks. Let's kind of pick it up from maybe the mid-90s and kind of what was going on then.
Well, I'll do that, but if I may digress and stop me at any time, there was a couple of interesting things that happened after the barcode days. I mentioned during our last session that the decade plus that I spent in the barcode industry taught me a number of lessons, chief among which, aside from Joe Kleinkemper and the importance of workforce engagement in building corporate ownership of new technology, was the indisputable fact that a barcode is little more than a curious decoration unless it has been accurately printed and applied to an item, and until it is read and validated by a high-performance scanner and decoder before the data that it contains is subsequently fed to a programmable logic controller or computer for action or storage. I bring this up, Chris, because I find, at least in the last 5 years or so, barcode is taken for granted by the marketplace. And there's some basics and fundamentals that I won't dwell on here, but the new users of that technology need to pay attention to as they go forward. It is not a slam dunk. Now, let me fast forward and talk about my foray into RFID. I live south of Santa Cruz, California, and I was brought here in 1981 by a legendary entrepreneur who also happened to be the CEO of one of the nation's oldest tanneries. I said tanneries, like cattle hides and sheep hides and what have you. Working with scientists from Los Alamos, Norman was looking to find a way to track cattle hides from ranches to his plant, to his tanning plant. Clearly a barcode wouldn't work, but he had developed, with help from Los Alamos, to create, or he developed, subdermal RFID tags. And the solution he and his team came up with worked. And it played a key role in assuring rancher and animal processing plant compliance with the tannery's traceability mandate and quality standards. He hired me, Norman Lesen did, to find other applications for the technology. It wasn't an easy task at the time, but the exercise reinforced something that I learned at 3M in my early career. That being that the cost of an item must be somewhere in the neighborhood of that item's value in the eyes of prospective buyer, and that value has to be clearly articulated by the seller. And finally, that the product itself has to substantiate the claims. Our first RFID tag at Norman's company sold for $80, a far cry from Walmart's dream of a 2-cent label. But they were reusable and on average could take 100 trips down an automobile assembly line, triggering the delivery of the right components to the line at the right location and time, and maintaining vehicle-specific audit trails along the way. Now, if you do the math, that's 80 cents a trip, a small price to pay for a bundle of value, that value being a properly assembled automobile. On the other hand, 80-cent tag wouldn't work on a box of cornflakes, and therein lay the rub. A year later, a chance meeting on a return flight to the West Coast led to an investment from and the subsequent acquisition of Norman's company by a division of Rockwell. At that point in my life, with a wife and 2 daughters who had become confirmed Californians, I could not even suggest a move to the upper Midwest when serendipity struck again. And we're getting to WMS here shortly. In 1974, at the National Material Handling Show in Chicago, I had an opportunity to chat with Vince Acapinti, the founder and CEO of the first WMS company, Logisticon. Vince is the father of WMS. He painted a wonderful picture of radio-controlled warehouses where operators were directed and lift trucks guided by wireless technology and software that would take the guesswork out of receiving, put away, picking, and shipping. And at that time, 1974, he offered me a job. I politely declined. 10 years later, in 1984, Vince's CEO, twice removed, offered me a position on Logisticon's board of directors, which I accepted. And a year later, the board invited me to take the CEO slot. With few other options at the time on the West Coast, I accepted. And then the fun began. After settling in about 2 weeks at Logisticon, getting to know the home office team and familiarizing myself with the product, I went to the field to meet the customers, sometimes with the salespeople responsible for the accounts, and oftentimes on my own. I learned more in the next 3 or 4 weeks than I ever would have learned on the phone or sitting behind my desk. On the customer side, most were quite pleased with the performance of their WMSs. Our technical team who supported installation, and our 24/7 support group, except for the Rust Belt company whose IT chief had taken it upon himself to modify our WMS source code beyond recognition and not document what he had done before he left the company. At the end of that visit, I apologized to the CEO and CFO of the Rust Belt company and wrote them a check for $25,000, which they had paid for the first year of our support. I had never done that before, and fortunately I've never done it since. It was a no-win situation, and the salesperson should have spotted the issue long before he closed the deal. Speaking of sales, let me characterize the Logisticon sales team as white-gloved, well-dressed, and articulate, but unfamiliar with the difference between a warehouse and an outhouse. In my experience, seasoned warehouse practitioners can spot a charlatan at the reception desk, if not in the parking lot. I provided job search report for each of the 4 salespeople at Logisticon, and within 6 weeks was fortunate enough to replace them with grizzly veterans with engineering degrees who knew warehousing and understood the WMS value proposition. With a new team on the front end, few competitors, a partnership with Hewlett-Packard, and a modest infusion of venture capital, we grew revenues to above $6.5 million within about 4 years. What I learned during that time, and a lesson that I impart to anyone who is interested in going forward with the warehouse management system, is that overlaying any new technology or system on ill-defined processes will only enable employees to do things badly faster. What I'd like to do now, if I may, Chris, is answer some of your questions. I have a list of things that I deem to be fairly important in putting together a WMS requirements list, but I'd like to get your input as well.
I'm just throwing darts out there because whatever you say is going to be certainly infinitely more interesting than what I say.
Well, we'll see. We can measure that after we're done.
I heard on a webinar that you had mentioned J.C. Penney's was a first user of WMS. Is that accurate, or?
Yeah, and it was actually Vince Acapinti, the guy from 1974's Material Handling Show, who put that system in. And he had come out of the Raymond Corporation, subsidiary of Raymond called Mobility Systems. It was 74. It was J.C. Penney, and they had radio terminals on lift trucks and wires in the floor to guide the trucks to their various destinations in the Penney's facility.
So that's a check mark. I got that one right.
You did. You know what? One point we talked last time about the Buick installation of barcoding.
Yes, sir.
This is a sidebar. That was in October of 1971, a good 2 or 3 years before the Marsh supermarket deployment of a UPC scanning system at their checkout counters. So we on the industrial side of the equation do indeed predate UPC. I just wish I had a penny for each of the barcode labels that have been scanned since that time.
And are still being scanned.
Exactly.
It kind of drives the world these days. You formed associations. I know in the prior call we spoke about AIM. You were involved with others as well?
Right. I stuck with MHI, which was the godfather of AIM, and I stayed with the organization because you can just find such an amazing number of opportunities through the networking that particular organization provides. I joined MHI, as I said last time, in 1971, but I've stayed with them since. I still participate in their meetings as we go along. In the mid-90s, with a number of companies offering warehouse management systems in the marketplace, we also collectively needed a broader platform to outline our message and the potential value that could be obtained from their deployment. In 1995, I believe, may have been late 94, we founded MHI's Warehouse Management Systems Group, WMS organization, under the MHI umbrella. We had a few marketing people who attended the meetings, and they thought that warehouse management systems was a bit passé, and we needed a more interesting name for the group. So from 94 or 5 to the early 2000s, we transitioned to a group called the Supply Chain Execution System Group, or association, underneath, again, the MHI umbrella. And anyone looking at WMS, either from a historical point of view or alternatively as a first pass before they move ahead with procurement and deployment of one of them, MHI is still a great resource. We did a lot of work on developing standards and specifications, copies of which I still see in the marketplace today.
How many members did you get eventually?
Well, we started with 4 or 5, and within a year we had 29. And that was tip of the iceberg, because behind those 29 were another 100 or 150 companies offering WMS, and therein lay the rub. It was about that time we were approaching the year 2000 challenges that the computer industry had to grapple with as we changed centuries. A number of people in the software development arena went out looking for work, and they found warehouse management as a possible place, imagining that, how complicated can a warehouse be? Stuff comes in, it's put somewhere, it's picked up, it's brought to a shipping dock, and it's shipped somewhere. Well, as most of us know who've been around for any length of time, it's a good bit more than that. But we had nearly 200 WMS companies across the globe, the majority of them here in the U.S. by the early 2000s.
And you remember the Magic Quadrant, the Gartner Magic Quadrant grid? That was always popular.
It was and remains so.
And that was Tom Ryan. You know Tom Ryan, perhaps.
I talked to Tom Ryan last week.
I don't think it was the creator, but back when I was coming of age, he was kind of the holder of the key for getting into the grid and getting rated and those types of things. And that's where I had mentioned to you, I learned about companies like Catalyst and Manhattan Associates and McHugh Freeman. There were a lot of companies back then. And John, I'm still surprised today. There are still probably that many companies out there and ones that are starting up. Why do you think that is?
Well, I would like to think first that the people doing the work in the WMS sphere are perhaps more sophisticated, more talented, more seasoned than the crowd we ran into in the 90s. But the flip side is in this country, aside from pantries and storage bins in your backyard, there are a good 600,000 warehouses in the United States. And my guess is even if we do a cutoff at, say, 50,000 square feet for a warehouse, the likelihood is that we've only tapped 35 or 40% of the available market for WMS. It just doesn't stop, and that's exciting. There is a group in Europe similar to Gartner, different but similar, called the Fraunhofer Group, who keeps tabs on what's going on in Europe and Asia very, very effectively. And I source them from time to time for information on companies over there who may not be terribly active in the United States, but indeed are active in the rest of the world.
Fraunhofer, how do you spell that, John?
Now you're testing me. Fraunhofer. I used to speak German, but that's a long time ago. And there isn't enough good wine around that would enable me to do a better job of pronouncing that language.
What happened at Logisticon? They're not around anymore.
Well, Logisticon imploded. I choose that word carefully. It got almost too big for its own britches. And two things happened to bring it to finality in the late 80s, early 90s. One of them was the pharmaceutical marketplace was a hot one for WMS, but the FDA introduced requirements for documentation that were beyond the resources available to the majority of the WMS providers. We spent, for example, in 1988 or so, over $1 million on documenting our software at Logisticon to meet the FDA requirements, and that almost broke the bank.
Today, that's very popular still with serialization and documenting your system changes.
Even more so, and more important, we didn't have the net. We didn't have the level of, for example, counterfeiting that are present throughout the supply chain, and the availability of traceability tools, not unlike WMS, transportation management systems, and the like. The industry is doing a very, very good job. You know, Chris, if I may, a couple of things as I was collecting my various thoughts in preparation for our two discussions, I think I'd like to put a title on it. I'll call it Getting Back to Basics. I said it earlier with respect to barcoding. The fundamentals still apply. And on the WMS side, I mentioned doing things badly faster with new technology. Now this is for the prospective users and perhaps for those who want to go in and get more out of their WMS than they currently are. I've read a couple of times, it's probably apocryphal, that on average 65 to 70% of the functionality delivered with WMSs is rarely used. It's hearsay, but it's hearsay from people in the marketplace. I think it's worth noting.
Why do you think that happens, John?
It's a function of the quality of the WMSs that a given prospective user is looking for, and the fact that there are a lot of very nifty features offered to differentiate the products that they're selling from the other ones on the market. And sometimes you can say, well, boy, that looks good. I bet we could use that. My question to them is, what can you use today? What will really get you where you want to be in terms of incremental levels of improvement over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and take baby steps to the door or on your way forward?
I viewed it just from my short tenure in the space. Often lack of training, full training, or the people that were trained leave and then it's not carried on. And then you'd mentioned something earlier, John, documentation.
Good Lord, yes, critical. If you missed it in our last broadcast, early in my career, I was a smoker, courtesy of Uncle Sam and the U.S. Army. And I learned more in a 10-minute smoke break in the yard outside the warehouse door from the people who actually did the work than I would in a 1-hour, 2-hour conference room session with senior management. And that's still true. We don't spend enough time getting the workforce engaged early on in the process of assessing what new technology might be able to do for throughput and productivity in a warehouse or distribution center. That said, there are a couple of other points I believe worth mentioning. First, the importance of gathering accurate data to the extent that a company can do it on current operations. What comes in, how much, what's it look like, what goes out, how much, when, etc., etc., etc. Documenting every step of the warehousing process in receiving, storage, picking, value-added processing, consolidation, and packaging, and ultimately staging for shipment. These are the primary areas that a good or solid WMS should be able to handle and handle well. How it does so depends upon how well you characterize current operations. Another one is developing key performance indicators. Now, most people are familiar with the acronym KPI. Georgia Tech for years did a good job of developing KPIs for warehousing. The Warehouse Education Research Council does an excellent job, led by a team. In fact, you may know him, Chris, Carl Manrup.
Yes, sir.
That is an invaluable tool if people take the time to obtain it from work and use it to measure how they're doing with respect to others. Now, that said, nobody knows a warehouse, your warehouse, better than you do. And if that can't be said, then you better go do your homework. But you need to identify what's meaningful, what will add value, and what will reduce cost in each of the areas that are primary in your facility. Another item that I had on my list, you need to document and do process flowing or diagramming on your current processes, and then use those as a foundation for identifying ways of tightening up flows, improving the throughput, shortcutting or eliminating unnecessary steps in the process, and building a set of target performance indicators. If I'm doing so many cartons per hour or week, how many could I do if I had the tools in place from a software point of view, and if I fine-tune the physical processes to streamline the process diagramming? Now, let's say that we've identified our KPIs. They provide an invaluable tool for building the business case and the actual value proposition. Envision, if you will, a series of tables, one for receiving, another for storage and put away, another for value-added processing, another for packing, shipping, and so on. And then create another table that illustrates what a better physical layout and process flow would do to those KPIs, and focus your attention on getting those things fixed first. Then finally, begin to take a look at what would happen to those flows and to your productivity with the addition of automatic identification, a warehouse management system, a labor management system, and compare the results. And have your people involved. Make sure you have your people involved in filling out those charts for and with you. Then the next step, how do you put a dollar value on these things? You can't do it in a vacuum. You need to get insights from your workforce. How much faster could you do this? How much damage do you think could be reduced if we did that, et cetera, et cetera. Then sit down with representatives of the various departments in the organization, for example, marketing and sales, finance, the operations chief or senior vice president, and say, here's what the team came up with in terms of establishing where we are today and where we might be able to go with the addition of technology and a warehouse management system, for example. And how much do you think that is worth, Mr. Head of Sales or Ms. Marketing Vice President? And spread it around the room. It's in a conference room. You're talking to your senior staff or senior management group. Ask them to put a value on the performance improvements that you see. And don't let up. Be persistent. Well, it's about such and such, says the head of sales. Well, no, you need to drill down and get hard and fast answers from them on what a 10% improvement in throughput might do to lift sales, for example. Then you turn to finance. What's that likely to be worth if we were able to achieve it? You can put together, in fact, I'm thinking of a Canadian company with whom we did work years ago, who put these charts together, established comparison between today's performance and possible performance with the installation or implementation of some barcode reading and a warehouse management system. Put them into charts for a presentation to the board of directors. The presentation took, it was given by the head of operations and the senior vice president of distribution. It took about a half an hour. It was a lot of work to put it together, but it only took 6 weeks to put it together in substantiable detail, and they approved it as presented. Now, one other thing that I commend to your readership is something called the DuPont model, financial tool, and at Georgia Tech, they spend a half a semester teaching it, so I'm not going to even attempt it except to say look it up and take a look at what you've put together in those charts that compare current operations versus could-be operations and see if you can't plug some of the numbers into the DuPont model in order to calculate probable return on investment, return on assets, and a number of other financial measures. This Canadian company I mentioned did just that, and it was a slam dunk. I used that phrase twice in this last hour, but it was a fairly straightforward presentation and easy sell on the part of the people who were actually going to buy and use the system. Final comment on them. The likely cost of the improvements that the Canadians proposed put in was about $1.6 million, and the return they expected to achieve was somewhere in the neighborhood, and they were a little optimistic in my view, of $1.8 million. As it turns out, they invested $2 million, and their first year's return on that investment was 1.6. That's not small potatoes. That's a pretty darn good profile, and one likely to get the attention of senior management.
It's interesting you mentioned, well, you said work, you threw work in there, and I didn't realize we would get a mini crash course on WMS selections and best practice implementations, and then you talked about the DuPont model. John, I used to do WMS seminars with work, back in the mid-90s with Eric Peters. I don't know if you know Eric Peters. I think you do.
Know Eric.
Yeah, he taught me about the DuPont model. That was part of what we spoke about. I went on to write a book for work called WMS Selection Strategy. A lot of that I learned from Eric, who I imagine learned it from you.
Yeah, Eric and I did work together.
Speaking of the work, it sounds like you've done implementations and consulting recently. Is that what you're doing now?
Well, let's say I'm in the catbird seat now. By that I mean I'm sitting on a branch up above the fray, providing input and insights to the team that actually is doing the serious work of assisting in identification of alternative solutions and selection of the best ones for the company's individual clients.
Are we allowed to say St. Ange? Is that
yes,
who you're
you
with?
pronounced it correctly, and I appreciate it.
They've been around for a while. Were you part of Cypress Associates after
Right.
Logisticon?
Well, we founded, a couple of us founded a company called Cypress Associates. And if the truth be known, where did I get Cypress? I don't know if you're a golfer, but I was invited to play Cypress Point the Sunday before we put the company together. And it seemed a natural name for the organization that we were about to build. And our first job was that Canadian company that I mentioned. It was a pure consulting play. My wife said I was old enough to be a consultant, perhaps.
Enough gray hair, perhaps.
Yeah, strangely enough, the hair hasn't changed. But I haven't stopped learning, and I continue to learn every day, as I hope everybody does. You and I may talk about later on at Cypress Associates. Just imagine, Chris, if you had a tool, today I would call it a child of artificial intelligence, that would enable you to put all the profiling data that I quickly scanned over into it to help you fairly quickly reconfigure from a physical point of view the way the flows ought to be in a given operation. And once you've done that and figured out how much those changes were going to cost you, then overlay on top of that the functionality that you've defined for a warehouse management system, and then run it as a simulation and determine where the pinch points are, fine-tune the model, and out will pop the costs for your physical improvements in the system that you've defined to run them or to make them play. So you do that, you buy the system, you buy the physical equipment, you implement and get it running, and a year or two down the road you decide that you're going to expand or you're going to contract. How about something that enables you to go back into the model, tweak it, and change it to reflect what you now have to do and go through the process all over again? That's what we were doing at Cypress Associates. And my friend who I mentioned in the last session, Dave Scott, and a number of other very solid people put that together and actually developed and ran it. The funding fell out at the time in the early 90s, well, by the mid-90s, and the company who had sponsored the development decided to get out of the warehouse management and logistics business. That said, somebody's going to do it, and the people who are working on AI and machine learning for the logistics industry or community are going to do that someday. I hope I'm here to see it.
Yeah, I thought you were describing a future state product, and then you said that's something you did many years ago. Interesting.
Well, it took some pretty solid people to take those ideas and turn them into working systems. But nonetheless, it's doable. And I just saw an AI company that's recently been launched by Princeton University, which kind of looks like it may have the secret sauce to do this again.
And on the theme of consulting companies, you were also part of eSync?
Yeah, eSync was founded by people who came out of the WMS industry. One company in particular that's no longer with us called Mark, if you remember them, and RGTI.
You know Bob Kennedy? Does that name ring a bell?
I know Bob Kennedy very well, thank you.
You know everybody, John.
Well, if you live long enough, I've been blessed with the networks that have admitted me to their fold.
I saw you have, in 2004, the Reed Apple Award. What was that for?
Oh, it means it awarded me points for showing up at MHI meetings. Okay. Actually, no, I'm not quite that. But Rudy Reed was a professor from Purdue, and Jim Apple Sr. was a professor at Georgia Tech. And from the academic perspective, these were the two gentlemen who really gave the world you and I and those listening live in a shot in the arm. And so the Reed Apple Award recognizes people who have contributed throughout their careers to the advancement of the material handling and logistics industry.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Jim Apple. That makes sense.
Well, you know the Jim Apple the younger, probably.
Probably, yes, sir.
Yeah, he's 60 now, so he's
Okay.
the kid. And if by any chance he happens to be listening, I say that in jest.
Okay.
The apple didn't fall. Oh God, what a horrible pun! But it didn't fall very far from the tree. And Jim and his dad, Jim, not Junior, but Jim the younger, and his dad made enormous contributions to our industry.
Well, John, I want to get maybe your predictions on the future of the WMS industry. Before we do, is there anything else from the historical perspective, or getting up to where we are today?
Don't wind me up. No, future, it's morphing. The industry is changing. For example, and I say this hopefully with impunity, those 29 companies that formed MHI's WMS and subsequently Supply Chain Execution Systems and Technology Group has morphed into something called MHI Solutions Community, which effectively recognize the fact that you can't fit a square peg in a round hole. It recognized the pervasiveness of the systems that have been developed to help people do a better job of moving products through the supply chain from source to consumption in an effective, efficient manner. It's not just WMS. It's not just transportation management systems or labor management. It's the entire group of them working together in an efficient, effective, and significant way such that the sum of the components exceeds the value of the total package. And MHI Solutions Community provides a venue for both suppliers of technology, developers of systems, and users of the two can communicate, collaborate, and move the package forward. I miss the WMS group, but they're part of the solutions community now. I miss a number of things that were enjoyable parts of my career, but I can't wait to see what the new breed brings. WMS won't go away. Well, I could say this safely, at least not in my lifetime, but the concepts will survive me and those who are currently playing the game with things that we barely imagined at this point in time. Somebody's going to develop that system that I mentioned Cypress put together back in the early 90s, and it's going to blow people's socks off.
Yeah, I've noticed a migration. Seldom is it just a standalone WMS anymore. It's WMS and warehouse control systems and robotics. Just from the recent Modex earlier this year, there was a lot of consolidation.
Absolutely. Warehouse execution systems, don't forget them. It's not alphabet soup, but in order to understand the differentiators between those alternative packages, people really need to dig down and determine what they need and then go out and take a look at what's available to do it correctly the first time.
Anything else before I ask you my final question?
Well, I can't wait for your final question. No.
Final today. So,
okay, Chris.
One thing I always like to wrap up on is getting people's perspective on careers in supply chain management. So if you were able to tell someone going into college or coming out of college or even making a transition into supply chain management, what recommendations would you give somebody?
I would go back to my college boy days and say, I wish to God I had had access to what's available to do today academically as well as for my summer job. I did do a few things in the summertime that were useful, and looking back, added value to my career portfolio. There is a group, maybe you're familiar with it, Chris, called CICME, CICMHE, the College Industry Council on Material Handling Education. It's a group of some 18 academics from various well-known institutions throughout North America and a couple from overseas who bands together to ensure that what they and their peers in academia are teaching, to ensure that it matches what we on the supply side are doing in actuality. KICME is a tremendous resource. It operates under, again, the umbrella of MHI, and it's certainly where I would point someone considering, after having teased him or her through the door, where I'd point them for next steps. And I can't discount CSCMP or WORK or APICS or IIE as other resources that they might tap. It's been a fun run for me, and I certainly look forward to seeing people continue to enter our industry, both on management teams, supervisory teams, as well as people doing the work.
Well, this has been great, John. I appreciate you investing time with me and sharing your perspectives. I wish we had more time. I guess we could have another session if you're ever up for it.
Don't tempt me, Chris.
But I have a final question back to the part 1 recording. You mentioned plainclothes Army. I don't know what that means.
I didn't wear a uniform.
Is that a special type of person, or you were a spy, or?
I don't want to tease you with this, but it was a job where I was able to dress in mufti, I love that word, civilian clothes, and get things done in an efficient fashion with a very solid team of people, not behind enemy lines, in between two wars, that being Korea and Vietnam. I don't mean to be mysterious, but that's enough. I was in the Army. It taught me my single bad habit. I managed to get rid of that 4.5 years ago.
Well, it's good for us. And again, thanks for your service.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
The Supply Chain Doctor interviews thought leaders and visionaries who have had an impact on the field of supply chain management, shares professional development concepts for practitioners, and investigates current and future trends in the industry. Interested in sponsoring this show to help you get your message out? Send a note to chris@thescdr.com. We can also help with world-class supply chain education and workshops for you and your team. Thanks for listening.